So we're continuing our talk about the writing down of the Mishnah and the related literature. Last time we talked about the Mishnah itself, how Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Beit Din, his court, wrote down and ordered and redacted the Mishnah. Amongst Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's students were people who took it upon themselves to then collect and write down and redact other literature from the same period. So what literature is that? So the Mishnaic period, as we would call it, there are different opinions about what we call the Mishnaic period, but let's say the Mishnaic period probably begins sometime in the mid to late the time of the Second Temple, and it continues up until this time, about the year 200, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi finalizes the Mishnah. Now, during that time, there's a lot of literature has been created, not necessarily written down, because remember, we're still working primarily with an oral transmission. But as we've discussed in earlier sessions, there are many things that have been discussed by now. Every halacha has been discussed and worked out in great detail. When Rabbi Yehuda Nasi redacts the Mishnah, what he had to do, he and his Beit Din, what they had to do is they had to actually edit out a lot of other shmuot, a lot of other pieces of literature, a lot of other essentially mishnayot, transmissions, in order to make the Mishnah as compact as possible. Mishnah is pretty big, but when we start to examine the other literature that was edited out, we understand that a lot of literature was left out. Now, why was it left out? Again, to make it compact, because we want to make the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wanted to make the Mishnah a book that a person could master, that they would be able to know it by heart, that they would be able to understand everything in it. So it's big, but it's not super huge. It's not beyond somebody's capability of learning and even learning by heart. When we bring in all of the other literature from the period of the Mishnah, it gets very big. Some people were capable of knowing all of that by heart, but not everybody was. Most people weren't. So these were collected into, the other pieces of literature were collected into different collections. So we'll talk about the collections. The first important collection is the Tosefta. The Tosefta is an Aramaic word that means addendum, something added on, or appendix. And the Tosefta was gathered and redacted by two prominent students of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbi Oshia and Rabbi Chia. And the Tosefta is essentially addenda to the Mishnah. It's written in the same order, that is, for each Masechet of Mishnah, you'll also find a Masechet of Tosefta. The chapters are not always exactly parallel, so sometimes you might have, let's say, 3 chapters in the Mishnah, you might only have 2 chapters in the Tosefta, or different combinations thereof. But in general, what we see is that if the Mishnah is talking about a certain topic, let's say in the beginning of the Mishnah we talk about the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, when we look in the Tosefta, we will see other Mishnayot that are talking about the same topic, and they fill out more information. The idea is that the Mishnah has all of the elements of the information that we need, but the Tosefta makes it easier for us to understand. So that's the first major compilation. Nowadays, the easiest, most accessible way to get it is in a standard Gemara. You'll find it printed in the back. In this standard Vilna Ram edition of the Gemara, the Tosefta is printed all the way in the back, and it's pretty plain, but you see at the top it says Tosefta, Baba Kama, Perek Rishon, Baba Kama, the first Perek, and here it's picking up, it says, Kol shechiyavti b'shmiratal chiyavti b'nisko. Everything that I have obliged you to pay, that I've obliged you to guard, I've also obliged you to pay for its damages. This is essentially a footnote to a Mishnah that's earlier on in the Masechet. And so it goes. So what we'll find in the Tosefta, it's going to fill out information and also varying opinions, maybe opinions that were not accepted in the Mishnah, but the other alternate opinions are recorded in the Tosefta. And very occasionally it will also introduce topics that were not in the Mishnah itself. But mainly, it's a very important piece of literature. There's a modern edition that was, it was a modern edition that was published by Rav Shal Lieberman, Zichrono Livracha, who spent most of his life trying to come up with a critical edition of the Tosefta. Of course, in the Mishnah, there are many editions of the Mishnah. We won't go through all of them today, but maybe later on I'll spend some time showing you different editions of Mishnah. So these are but we have the Mishnah, we have the Tosefta. What other pieces of literature came from this Tannaitic era? So we also have the Braitot. A Braita is a piece of Tannaitic literature, like a Mishnah, that also is not included in the Mishnah, and that's why it's called a Braita. Braita is Aramaic for outside. It's outside literature that did not make it into the Mishnah. And actually, Braita is a Shem Kolel, it's a very inclusive term that includes the Tosefta. It actually includes any Tannaitic literature that didn't get in the Mishnah. It also includes Mishnayot, those pieces of literature that were not included in any other collection. And so sometimes we'll have a Braita in the Gemara that we actually don't find anywhere else. We'll find it in the Gemara and nowhere else. The other major collections of Tannaitic literature are the Midrashei Halacha. And these are in contrast to the Mishnah. We've discussed before that the Mishnah is essentially Halacha without Midrash. That is, we don't have the verses in the Torah that the Halacha is based on. We strip that away, and what we're left with is the Mishnah. But in this generation of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Talmidim, his students, there were people who wanted to preserve the connection between the Mishnah and the text of the Torah, and so they wrote down the Midrashei Halacha. The Midrashei Halacha are as follows. Mainly, the Mechilta, which is the Midrash Halacha and Sefer Shmot, the Torat Kohanim, also known as the Sifra on Sefer Vayikra, and the Sifrei, which is on Bamidbar and Dvarim. So if we look at those, what we'll see is it goes through in the order of the Torah, verse by verse, and explains for each verse how Chazal understood that verse. And that makes the connection then between the conclusion, which we would find, let's say, in the Mishnah or in a Braita, Tosefta. It'll make that connection with the verse. It's in the Torah. It's not clear which came first. There's a kind of chicken and egg problem here. There's a kind of chicken and egg problem here about which came first. Did the Midrash Halacha come first and only now it's being written down? Or the Midrashei Halacha, an attempt to reconstruct the original, to reconstruct the original relationship between the Torah and the Mishnah? And we're not going to try to settle that here today, but this is just a brief summary of all of the Tannaitic literature that's written down in the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his immediate students.